Spring 1813. In North America, the British and United States are firmly embroiled in what will become the War of 1812. Despite the Americans holding the advantage in numbers and surprise, so far the British have won key victories, preventing any incursion into Canada. Though that is all about to change, as at the head of a new naval force, the US now plans to strike directly at the heart of Canada, the capital of York. At the outbreak of war in 1812, the American force on the Niagara frontier, under General Stephen von Rensselaer, was tasked with a strike into Upper Canada. In Washington, Secretary of War William Eustis believed resistance in Canada would be light, with most of the British forces tied down fighting the Napoleonic Wars in Europe. Though this assumption would prove a grave miscalculation. Despite the British forces being completely unprepared, the Americans were severely undersupplied and undermanned, forcing Rensselaer to delay the invasion until October, critically giving the British time to prepare. Rensselaer's subsequent crossing would see his force decisively defeated in the Battle of Queenston Heights. The following winter, Eustis would resign, being replaced in February with John Armstrong, who would quickly move to rectify the situation. At the outbreak of the conflict, the British fleet under the Provincial Marine would far outnumber any American naval force on the Great Lakes, allowing British forces to quickly seize control of the vital shipping lanes, along which troops and supplies could easily flow. As Armstrong would soon realize, without control of the Great Lakes, any invasion into Canada was impossible. But if the US could obtain naval dominance, the supply to all the British forts and outposts upstream would be cut. In 1812, the US had designated Sackett's Harbor to begin their naval buildup on Lake Ontario, constructing a major shipyard, bringing in thousands of workers, sailors, and soldiers. The British, realizing the importance of the shipyard, would attempt to destroy it in July of 1812, but their fleet would be repulsed after several hours. By 1813, the town would be designated the U.S. Naval Headquarters on the Great Lakes, employing 3,000 highly skilled craftsmen and housing roughly 8,000 workers, sailors, and soldiers, rapidly building 11 warships and many smaller boats and transports. Command of the new fleet would be given to Commodore Isaac Chauncey. Across the lake at Kingston Harbor, the Provincial Marine, having been unable to destroy the fleet at Sackett's Harbor, would quickly begin ramping up their own production of naval warships, beginning a vigorous arms race for naval dominance on Lake Ontario. But by the spring of 1813, it will become obvious the Americans are winning, as the Provincial Marine shipbuilding efforts have proved slower, shifting naval dominance on Lake Ontario to the United States. With the power of their new fleet, Armstrong will devise a plan to strike a crippling blow to the British war effort, one that, if successful, will completely shift the war in Canada. Armstrong and Chauncey, along with Major General Henry Dearborn, American commander of the Army of the North, would devise a plan to strike the British naval yard at Kingston. Armstrong was concerned that when the St. Lawrence River thawed in spring, British naval reinforcements might once again shift the balance of power on Lake Ontario. If the British fleet at Kingston could be preemptively captured or destroyed, it would almost guarantee continued American naval dominance, which would make any attempt at continued British resistance in Upper Canada untenable. That winter, Dearborn would begin to concentrate his forces at Sackett's Harbor, preparing to launch the strike in early April. Though Dearborn would soon receive concerning news. British Major General Roger Sheaffe, who had succeeded Brock as commander of Upper Canada, would fall sick, incapacitating him over the winter. As a result, Lieutenant General Sir George Prevost, British Governor General of Canada, would march south the following month to help conduct military duties. The force that accompanied him along the frozen St. Lawrence River would prove a major threat to the American plan. In February, a detachment would win a victory over the American garrison at the Battle of Ogdensburg before continuing to Upper Canada. Once Prevost arrives at Kingston, Dearborn begins receiving several reports stating that with the reinforcements, the garrison now numbers over 6,000 British regulars, a force that would rival their own, making the prospect of battle a risky gamble. Though in reality, the army that has accompanied Prevost is small, numbering less than 1,000 men. Meaning when Prevost returns to Lower Canada the next month, the true size of the Kingston garrison numbers only 600 regulars and 1,400 militia, compared to Dearborn's expected force of 7,000 regulars. Though despite receiving new information about the true size of Kingston's garrison, Dearborn and Chauncey decide a direct attack on Kingston is too risky. Instead, they hope to strike the less fortified administrative capital of Upper Canada. York is a vital supply point along Lake Ontario. Its destruction would significantly hamper British supply lines and serve as a much-needed political win in Washington. Though it would leave the fleet of the Provincial Marine intact, allowing reinforcements or continued shipbuilding efforts to possibly allow the British Navy to regain naval dominance. Though with approval from Armstrong and Washington, they will nevertheless shift targets. In early April, Dearborn will receive his final reinforcements from Plattsburgh under Brigadier General Zebulon Pike. Though his force will fall far short of the planned 7,000, primarily due to sickness and exposure, as the dense troop encampments create a breeding ground for infectious diseases. Still, Dearborn is confident in his new target of York, though the attack will be delayed by winter weather, finally departing on April 24th. Unlike the dockyard at Kingston, York would be far less fortified. The town itself was situated along the Don River in what is now Toronto Harbor. The main defense would be Fort York, though it would be lightly held, with just several cannons scattered across the fort's earthworks, with the main Government House battery containing two 12-pounders. Further down the shore, the western battery, situated in a small earthwork, would house an additional two 18-pounders. Several blockhouses would also be scattered across the harbor, with one at Gibraltar Point and a second just east of the Don River. Defense of the town was generally left to the York militia, though in an unfortunate chance of events, several days before, General Scaife and the roughly 300 British regulars accompanying him would stop in York to conduct business. As a result, when the U.S. force departed on the 24th, Scaife would delay his departure due to the news of a possible American attack. Though even with the addition of Schaife's regulars, the British force would be decisively outnumbered compared to the 1,700 U.S. regulars under Dearborn. And more importantly, the British cannons would number between 12 to 15, with most being old and outdated, compared to the 14 American ships, who together had a combined 112 guns. By the morning of April 26th, British sentries stationed at Scarborough Heights, roughly 16 miles or 26 kilometers to the east, would spot the American fleet. In York, Scaife would quickly rush to prepare, assembling his 300 regulars and between 40 to 50 native warriors, though only 300 of the York militia could successfully muster on the short notice. Scaife anticipated the Americans would launch a two-pronged attack, with the main force landing west of Fort York and a second landing in Scarborough to cut off a potential retreat to Kingston. To counter this threat, he would position the native warriors and skirmishers in the woods to the west, while concentrating his regulars at Fort York and the militia to the east near the town's blockhouse. By the next morning, Chauncey's squadron, consisting of a ship-rigged corvette, a brig, and 12 schooners, would cross into view. As the sun crested the horizon the following morning, the American force would prepare for their attack. Dearborn would serve as overall commander of the American force. Though choosing to remain aboard the ships, he would place Brigadier General Zebulon Pike in charge of the landing force, which in total would number 1,700 U.S. infantry, most being professional regulars. By early morning, the American landing is underway, as the first wave of boats, containing roughly 300 soldiers under Major Benjamin Forsyth, aim to land about 4 miles west of York, while the Navy begins what will be an all-day bombardment of the British positions along the coastline, covering the hillside in explosions and grape shot. The American landing was intended for a clear field west of the fort, though the strong winds on the lake have thwarted that idea, as the landing craft has been pushed further down the coast than expected, meaning they will now have to fight through dense woods before reaching the town. Within minutes of landing, they will come under fire from the small native contingent, as well as a single company of British grenadiers. In the town, Scaife would quickly dispatch more infantry to try and prevent the American landing, though American naval fire will render the waterfront road impassable. meaning the much-needed British reinforcements will have to traverse through the dense woods inland in order to reach the landing site. Without additional support, the small British native contingent can do little to stop the Americans. As a second wave of boats arrive with an additional 300 infantry and General Pike, they will launch an attack, outflanking the native contingent and forcing them back into the woods. Realizing his error, as it has now become evident there will be no American attack from the east, Scaife orders all his troops to reposition to the west. Though the delay has allowed the American force to land, mostly uncontested. In a last-ditch attempt to drive the U.S. infantry back, the British Grenadiers would launch a bayonet charge, though it will be repulsed with heavy losses. Despite the arrival of British reinforcements, they would continue to be driven back, as the American force under Pike would slowly fire in advance by platoon, supported by their 2 6-pounder field guns and the roughly 112 guns aboard the fleet. With the arrival of Scaife and the final British reinforcements, he will attempt to launch a counterattack, though due to the onslaught of fire, it will quickly be abandoned. Scaife, realizing his disposition, would begin to withdraw, hoping to regroup and make a further stand near the Western Battery. Meanwhile, on the lake, the American ships had sailed further east, beginning their bombardment of the Western Battery and Fort York. The British guns, old and outdated, would return fire, though it would have little effect, as the American cannons would tear through the earthworks. Just as the British force was beginning to reform near the Western Battery, an incoming cannonball would strike a magazine. The resulting explosion would kill 20 British soldiers and leave many disoriented and wounded. Realizing the futility of attempting to reorganize the men, Scaife would order them to fall back further, eventually reforming in a small ravine along Garrison Creek, just north of the fort, where they would be reinforced by militia from the town. As the American force advanced, they would assemble within artillery range of the fort, opening fire from the west. The naval force had also closed, bombarding the fort from the south. Fort York stood little chance, operating just under half a dozen outdated guns, compared to the Americans' 114. Scaife would soon realize the battle was lost. Around noon, he would begin to withdraw his force, setting fire to the sloop of war under construction at York's naval shipyard and rigging the fort's magazine to blow, leaving the York militia to cover their retreat and surrender the town. By 1 p.m., the continued American advance would put them within 200 yards of the fort, continuing their bombardment. The resulting explosion of roughly 300 barrels of gunpowder would fling 74 tons of iron shells in a 500-yard radius. General Pike and 37 other American soldiers would be killed in the explosion, which would cause an additional 222 casualties. Fearing the British might launch a counterattack, the American force would pull back to regroup, waiting for the British regulars to fully depart before advancing on the town and the fort. By nightfall, the militia would surrender the town. The American force would subsequently loot and burn the legislative buildings and the fort, before departing 2 weeks later for the Niagara Peninsula.